So I want to introduce our speaker now, Dr. Janine Jones, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the UW. She's a licensed psychologist and a nationally certified school psychologist. And Dr. Jones is the editor of a book, The Psychology of Multiculturalism in the Schools, a primer for practice, training, and research. And her research, teaching, and her clinical practice focus on culturally competent service delivery and resilience in children and adolescents from a cultural perspective. And she's currently conducting research on multicultural counseling and the associated best practices for serving children and their families. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Janine Jones. Thank you. It's nice to meet you. Good to meet you. All right. Got it? Uh-huh.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here. This is fun. I never get to come over to social work, so I wore the wrong shoes to walk across campus, so please excuse me if I start limping. I want to talk about multicultural contexts and talk about evidence-based practices. And I was told that there would be graduate students, there would be faculty, there would be community service providers in here, and so can I get an idea of who's here? So community service providers. Okay, and providing counseling, clinical groups, okay. Graduate students, social work, psychology? Social work, okay, and then faculty. Did I miss somebody? There were hands, I missed. Anybody I did not get representation from? UWA? AA, okay, great. All right, so I will try to speak to all of you. If I am not speaking your language, please let me know because I want to be respectful of that. I definitely have a bent on working from a counseling perspective, and so what I wanted to do is give you kind of a balance between talking about practice, but then also talking about what you would be looking for if you were making a referral to practice. As was mentioned, the work that I'm doing now is I'm doing a study of multicultural counseling with practitioners that half of the group was trained in doing CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, and the other half of the group was trained in a cognitive behavior therapy model with culturally responsive interventions in it. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today has to do with the culturally responsive piece of the work that second group is doing, and I'll give you a little bit of information about the study and some of the findings. So here I'm going to just give you a few objectives. One, you're going to learn the components of multiculturalism in clinical relationships. You'll learn about multicultural awareness and how it will improve effectiveness in practice. And then how to weave cultural variables into all phases of the intervention process. And that's the one that might be a little bit too detailed for some, and so just kind of signal me if it's a little bit too much detail. But where I want to start is multicultural profiles, because a lot of people will talk about culture and some will feel that they do not have culture, and I'm saying absolutely that is not the truth, that everyone has culture. But I'll talk about my profile. So one of the first things that you might notice about me is I happen to be African American. That is a big part of my identity, how I think, how I act, how I view the world. But I also happen to be religious, which is something you may not see when you see me unless I display it in a particular way, but it does shape how I think and how I view the world and how I see other people. I also happen to be a woman. Hope you figured that one out, because that one is probably a visual that you might be able to get. I also, now this is one that you can't just notice from looking at me, but I do associate with multiple socioeconomic class statuses. So in different phases of my life, I've lived at different class levels, and so I know how to identify with different experiences that people have. Also part of my multicultural profile. And then finally, I also can speak different languages, and so these are languages other than English, one language in particular, and then I also speak different English dialects, including Black dialect. So I might be able to go from one situation to another situation and communicate in a way that is socially acceptable and builds connections depending upon who is there. And so if we think about that being my profile, imagine yourselves and think about how complex your own multicultural profile might be. And then imagine the people that you're serving and think about how complex their multicultural profile might be. So if you have just a visual like this in your mind, it will help you think about the interactions that you have on an individual basis, on a supervisory basis with the people that you work with, as well as the clients that they happen to be serving. So, what is multiculturalism? One, it is a social and political construct, for sure. So this is something that's defined by social dynamics, but it also is recognizing the differences between individuals, and it's seen as a source of strength. And so we talk a lot about how we look at other people and how we interpret what they're doing and how they're thinking and feeling. But at the same time, we have to recognize that those might be strengths for that particular person, even if it differs from how we view the world ourselves. Multiculturalism includes all of the constructs that we think about, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and class, but they're all coexisting simultaneously. And so there are authors that have written about the definition of multiculturalism, and they will say that at least 3 or more coexisting cultures are interacting at one time. So the best part of multiculturalism, I believe, is that it demonstrates respect for individuals and groups as a principle that's fundamental for success and growth. So not working from just the practice that we know and the specific steps of our practice that we know, but to actually integrate all of those pieces that are really important to the individual that we happen to be serving. And finally here, the multicultural paradigm, what it does is it allows for a reduction in the biases that we may have toward the dominant culture or within the dominant culture, and include more diverse perspectives, which is really challenging to do when we're walking through the world, viewing through our own lens, and then not really recognizing how to integrate other perspectives. And so what I'm talking about today is kind of what that process looks like and how to develop the ability to do that and view the world in different ways, despite your own life experiences. So how can multicultural awareness improve effectiveness? Sorry about VeriSign up there. Improve the effectiveness of service providers. So one, because multiculturalism includes the belief that there are multiple realities and perspectives in the clinical relationship, you can't help but to serve people in a better way because you have to individualize the work that you're doing. Also recognizing that the reality of yourself as well as the clients that you're serving is constructed from the clinician's perspective as well as the client's perspective. So think about those interactions that happen where you are with one other person and you watch something or you observe an interaction and one of you leave and then talk about it and one of you perceives something completely different than the other. It's not that either is wrong, it's that either is viewed through the lens that you've been raised. And so imagine an interaction where there's power attached to it. So most interactions in community service settings, there is power. Someone has more power than the other person. So if the person that has less power does not articulate what their view is, then what happens? The person that has more power is the one to lead where the direction that's being followed. The intersection of the realities is complex, just like I showed that Venn diagram, how complex I am as an individual and how complex you are as an individual. But the intersection of the realities can affect the development of rapport, so how the relationship develops and how comfortable people get with one another, as well as how the interventions are designed and implemented. So if you're thinking about how do you make decisions about what you're going to do for a particular person, do you think based on the resources that are available? Or do you think based on what's standard practice for the setting that you're in? Or do you think, start there and then think about, okay, well, what does this person really need? And in their cultural context, what fits the best? And last here, multiculturalism guides and directs clinicians by creating a template for culturally responsive standards of practice. So that's all my broad stuff. I'm going to stop on the broad. I'm going to go to the more narrow now. So I have a frame that I use in my work and in my practice, and that is to look at the world from a an approach of multicultural intentionality. And I feel that you can't be, it's hard to see, I'm sorry that it's all faded out, but you can't have multicultural intentionality without three components that I'm going to show. So first is cultural self-awareness. So this is that knowing your own culture, knowing how you view the world and how it may differ from other people. So being able to have that awareness to analyze yourself and recognize that there are biases. We all have biases. So recognize that there may be bias there and it may influence the decisions that you make. Building cultural literacy. So you have to be able to understand other groups. And so this is the other awareness. So knowing what the group norms that are common to a particular culture, and then how that might impact that particular person. So we call that building cultural literacy, or understanding of other awareness. And then third, being able to do individualized interventions. And so if you've been participating in these series, you've seen that there are evidence-based practices, there are models that we have that are quite clear for what are steps to follow to serve a person, but there is an important aspect that you have to keep in mind, that they do still need to be individualized. You can still follow those same procedures, but you have to individualize them to the needs of a particular person. And so I'm going to speak from culture as doing that. So I feel like those three aspects, they all are related to multicultural intentionality, which is a model of practice, being intentional about the work that you're doing in the context of the person that you're serving. And so those three pieces there, you'll see that in the work of Sue and Sue. So if anybody's read the book Counseling the Culturally Different or Culturally Diverse in later editions of it. And so it's a three-pronged model that really talks about how to serve clients. And so the multicultural intentionality piece is just a newer term to describe the approach that you take. All right, so I'm going to talk about each one of those now. So cultural self-awareness. What this is really trying to understand the personal and the professional characteristics that shape the worldview of the clinician, the practitioner, the manager, the mentor. So knowing yourself before you have any interactions with someone else with regard to the clients that you're serving, if you're in a management kind of a position. There's lots of ways to increase self-awareness. So I'm teaching a class in multiculturalism in the schools right now, and the whole quarter, part of the growth experiences for the students are for them to learn about another culture, interact with people of another culture, ask questions, develop a relationship, take notes, and they're journaling throughout the quarter. So every week they have to write about their experiences and what they mean to them, and I'm watching them build their own awareness of themselves in the context of their own life experiences. There are some self-awareness tools that are out there, and these are pretty much just checklists that you can do, not anything that you have to give to anybody else, but it gives you an idea of where you might fall in different areas. And so the California Brief Multicultural Competency Scale is one. There are many others, and if you email me, I can send you more. The second one is a self-assessment checklist for personnel providing services and supports to children and their families, but it's in schools. And one of the things that I really like about that measure is it's not only about you as an individual, but it also looks at your environment, your immediate environment. So what do people see when they come to interact with you? So if you happen to be like a school counselor and you have an office in the school, when a child comes to you, are there things in your office that suggest that they can talk to you about cultural things or cultural dynamics? As I mentioned, journaling, and if you do counseling, so we do cultural genograms. So if you do a traditional genogram, which is pretty much like a family tree, you can also do a cultural genogram that looks at the dynamics or interactions between family members and how much culture plays a role in how they function and cope with stress. And then finally, consultation. And consultation, the intent of that is really to talk with somebody. Use a cultural broker, which is someone that would have a good understanding of a culture that you're working with, but ask them questions and have them educate you on what possibly might be interfering with work or enhancing the work that you're doing. Okay, and I feel I have this tendency I want to say questions, but I know I have to get through them, and then we're doing questions at the end. I hope that's okay with everybody. So would you write them down as we go? Okay. All right, so building cultural literacy. Here, you're increasing knowledge about a culture, another culture, of other people, and placing it in context. And so there is no better way to learn than to have a person that you're thinking of when you're learning about a culture. And so I talk to my students, and they say I say it too much, but I often say that it is almost impossible to learn about another culture in the absence of a relationship. So if you read in a book, you can read something, like think about when you're traveling. You can read about a culture and you can prepare and say, okay, that's something I should know before I go. But if you don't talk to a person, you don't know any of the within group differences. You don't know any variability. So if you have this foundation, that's a great start. But when you have a real relationship with somebody, they can tell you the nuances. They can tell you all of the other pieces that are related that will help you not make cultural blunders, which are, I call them cultural blunders when you do something that completely violates another culture and don't even realize that you offended them. And so those happen kind of easily if you have no awareness. So building cultural literacy is important. So there are techniques to build cultural literacy, and oops, I skipped ahead. One of them is what I have my students doing in class right now, and we're having them do cultural plunges, which is they go out and they choose whatever community they want to learn more about, and over the course of the quarter, they make 2 visits or 2 connections with somebody from that particular group. And so they're doing all different kinds of experiences, and the rule is for this building the cultural literacy, they have to go alone. And I used to teach at Seattle Pacific University, and the first time I did this, I said, yes, pick a population, go visit, and thought, that'll work out fine. And that next Sunday, I went to church, and I was attending all African American church at the time, and I looked back right before I left, and there was a group of 8 of my students at the back of the church, and I thought, that didn't work. So I have to rework that. So I made this new rule, and the new rule is they have to go alone. And why would I suggest that? Why would I say go alone? You say? To interact. To force them to interact, to make them uncomfortable. Part of the thing is you have to know the experience of somebody that's one of few, right? So to be one of few or the only one would help us understand that. Right.
Stay in your bubble the whole time.
And that's what they did. Yeah, they came in and they watched the service. They watched the service, not interacted with the service. And then the service ended, and I turned around. I was like, oh! And then I saw them all leaving. So they didn't talk with anybody. They didn't even interact with me. And so and I'm glad they didn't, because I didn't want to have to feel like I needed to create their experience for them. But what's happening now as I'm reading through these journals, they're beautiful because they are uncomfortable, and then there's these confused situations like, oh my gosh, I did this, but I think I might have offended everybody because they turned and went the other way, and then I was standing there alone, and they were trying to reach out, but maybe I was too pushy, or maybe they didn't like me, or maybe I was intrusive. And that whole process that's happening with my students right now is awesome, because that's experience that I have every day in different places. And so I'm trying to help them recognize that, because then when they're working with a family that is of that culture or of a different culture, they may remember, that whole emotional memory that we have, they may remember what they experienced. And so I feel like that's one of the richest ways to do it. And they don't like to have to go by themselves thing. They really don't. And but one of my students last week, she came and she goes, I went this place, and then I looked across the room, and such was there. And so, do I have to do another one? I was like, no, you can do this one as long as you were going around together. And so I also didn't mention I have another component too that's included. So not only doing these plunges, but also I'm asking by the second one that they take a risk. And the risk is that they learn someone's name, get their email address, and take them to coffee or lunch. And then I have questions to guide that, because of course they were like, I have to what? And I'm like, you don't have to spend any money, you can make them tea, it's fine. But find someone that you interact with in this setting, and then take them to lunch or to coffee. And then I have a couple of questions for them to ask. And these are not that deep of questions, but it's really about exploring the relationship or building that relationship. And so it's asking things like, what's something that is so important to you that guides your thinking every day? So they're not using trigger words like, tell me about your culture, something really broad that's hard to define. But to ask what's something that's deeply meaningful to you and explains how you think about the world. What's something key that you would want to know from someone that differs from you? So then they have to share about themselves and how they might think differently. And so we haven't, only one or two have gotten there thus far, but by the end of the quarter, everybody will have done this. And then hopefully it will have shaped how they interact with people that are different from themselves. So, I talk to them about concepts that they have to consider, and so here's some when it comes to cultural literacy. One is communication style. So, are you a close talker? If you're a close talker, pay attention if that is appropriate in the culture that you're interacting with, because you may push people away, or you may make them uncomfortable. So thinking about what is your own communication style, and then what is a common communication style between the other cultures. So some are very close in proximity, some are far away, some are indirect kind of communication verbally, so speaking indirectly but not very directly, whereas most Americans speak very directly and feel like, if you're straightforward and you speak direct about a particular topic, that's respectful, right? But others may not feel that way. They may feel like, no, it's a process. Think process rather than direct. So, relationships between cultural groups. So that is, you have to kind of know what the dynamics are. And so if you've probably read plenty and have witnessed plenty of interactions between Black and white Americans and know that there's complexities involved in that kind of relationship, if you are from one or the other group, you are going to walk in with the perspective of one but not the other without having gone through the developing cultural literacy. And then recognizing the impact of the simultaneous development of identity and ethnic identity. And this is particularly important if you work with adolescents. And I have a couple slides that I'll talk you through some of those concepts. But it's really important that it is very complex and troubling time for a lot of kids of color as they're trying to figure out their way. And so we hear them talk about the relationships and all the mean girls and that kind of stuff. But then when you have kids of color, there's another layer of trying to figure out who am I and what am I. And then last there is that there are stressors associated with living in a multicultural context, and recognizing that those exist quite early in childhood. They begin very early, and there's a lot of literature in the past that had suggested that kids don't really see race or they don't see color until later in life, and we know that now that that's absolutely not true. And if you have children, you know that that's absolutely not true. All right, so let me, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on identity development, but I do want you to see the citations there. So this is one model. There are, if you've read Sue and Sue, there's lots of models that are group specific. So there's like an African American identity development, and white racial identity development, and Asian identity development, and multiracial. And so there's lots of specific group models, but then this one is one that kind of encompasses multiple groups at once. And so this is why I'm exposing you to this one. What they're doing is it's a conceptual framework, and it captures the complex interactions of the client's cultural background, their life experiences, and their attitudes and beliefs toward other people. And it was originally designed to be a stage model, so it had steps that you would progress through, and now it is known to not be stage model. It's more cyclical. So this first, I'll just kind of give you brief hits on what they are. But conformity, this is like when a child from a minority group prefers to be like the dominant group, and so they will identify as different from themselves, and they feel like all of those constructs are right and ideal. Whereas dissonance is when a situation occurs, and to that particular person, they will see, oh my gosh, it's impossible. I can't say that so I'll give an example of a client I've had, little African American girl, and she was 5 at the time, and she was sure she was white. Where she went to school, what she chose to do, the kinds of things, all the dolls she wanted to play with were all white. And that was very much a conformity identity development. But then if you shift to dissonance, then something happened. Somebody told her, you can't have that doll. You're supposed to have a doll that looks like you. And it changed her view and made her feel quite confused and uncomfortable. And so that created a state of dissonance for her. And then there's resistance and immersion, and I saw her when she was little, so I can't say when she got to this point, but resistance and immersion is a point basically where the person kind of swings back on the other side of the pendulum. So now it's more like, I am completely immersed into my culture. Anything different from that is not good, it's wrong, and I'm going to fight any person that tries to make me think otherwise. Then there's introspection, where it's like, oh, okay, maybe I was a little wrong about that. And then you come back and kind of think, there's good and bad in all groups. And there's, I don't want to have that hatred of that part of me that used to feel like the dominant culture was ideal. And so there's a little more forgiveness there, and also self-insight. And then last, we have integrative awareness. And here it's really where there's this unique sense of security and confidence, and you can really accept and appreciate the multiple aspects of different cultures. So not just between two groups, but really all cultures, that there's good and there's bad, and accepting that complex relationship is a good thing. And so you can see I kind of started with what sounded negative all the way to what appears to be really positive. But now what we've learned since the model has been developed is that there could be a situation that occurs that sends someone right back to dissonance, or sends someone right back. So even if they move this far ahead, it shifts them all the way back to maybe conformity. And it may be situational. Or a person could be interacting in one setting and show a certain level of identity development, and then shift to another setting and show a different level. And that's kind of how complex we're seeing identity now. So, but knowing all of this, and so you want to study them more and understand them even more in more detail. But once you know this, then you can think, gosh, now if I'm interacting with somebody and I have no idea where they are on this continuum, I don't know how they're viewing me, and I don't know how to interact with them. So identity development is important. We also find acculturation is really important. And acculturation, this is the concept that relates to a person's cultural perspective when they're exposed to another culture. So how do they respond? And so I kind of adapted, this is a model by Barry from 1990, and so I adapted it because I feel like it shows the continuum a little bit better. So if you notice at the top where it says yes, and then the vertical line, it says you maintain the native cultural identity. And so when you go up, it's yes, they tend to maintain it, but if you're going down, then it's no, they're not maintaining it, they're going more like mainstream culture. And then if you look at the horizontal arrows, that's saying, are they adopting the majority culture or not? So in those two directions, there's 4 different labels that Barry has identified. And so the first I'll just describe as assimilation. So assimilation, this is much like what I described when I talked about that conformity piece, that it's a strategy, it's an acculturation strategy where the person adopts the cultural characteristics and values of the majority culture. So it feels very much more comfortable to do it that way. But if I go to the upper right quadrant, separation, this is an approach where the person maintains the native cultural identity and rejects the values and characteristics of the majority culture. So which identity development stage does that sound like? Yeah, that resistance immersion, exactly. So it's the complete opposite of that. And then we have, let's go to the upper left, integration. And here is the strategy where the client chooses to adopt the characteristics of the host majority culture, but also maintain their native cultural identity. So what does that sound like in terms of identity development? The integrative awareness, yeah, that last one. And then if we go to individualism, You can probably guess. If you're an individual, don't identify with anybody, that's pretty much what they're doing, is they're not adopting the majority culture and not maintaining the minority culture. The people that use the individualism strategy perceive the most stress typically, because there's no one to identify with. So he used to call that marginalized, and he changed it to individualism because there's negative connotations of marginalization. So he changed it to be individualism in 1990. So, but you can still imagine that person might feel marginalized, but they're marginalizing themselves because they're choosing not to connect with either one. So from that, I kind of created something to think, so in terms of being a service provider or a clinician, what the relationship, how much cultural knowledge you need to have. And so let me pull up the whole model here. So here's the same terms that I just showed you in terms of the acculturation strategies. And so like on the integration model, my thought is that a person that is providing the services has to have moderate to high cultural competence. Their training needs to be in culture, needs to be moderate to high, and then embedded into the service there need to be some cultural components embedded in. But if you get to separation, now remember that's the person that feels like they absolutely do not identify with the majority culture, right? So your competence as a provider needs to be really high. Training is high, and then also the cultural relevance of the treatment services primarily have to be integrated. So most of the services that you provide have to be in a cultural context. Low, low, and none for the individualism, partially because they're not identifying with any group. So how would you figure out how to serve them? Ask what their needs are, because you have to figure it out. You have to figure out where they are so that you can move forward from there. And then assimilation, we're in the moderate here. So moderate training, moderate cultural competence, and then some. So on this side, minimal serious efforts have to be made in integrating culture, but very significant efforts have to be made when you come to the separation group. So now I've talked about self-awareness, I've talked about building cultural literacy, and then I'm now talking about integration of the cultural variables into the work that you do. Here we're honoring the human variation between and within groups, and it is definitely affected by those cultural literacy things that I just talked about. So ethnic identity development and acculturation are two key concepts that have to be addressed and observed. And I train students to do things called intentional multicultural interviews, and so I just have a couple of questions that are in there. Part of what I've found, and I'll talk a little bit about the study that I'm doing now, but part of what I do is I talk to them about keeping culture on the table at all times. So the work that you're doing, giving the space to talk about culture and the impact, particularly if you're in a cross-cultural relationship. So example would be in my study, I not only have the two groups that were trained in, one trained in a culturally responsive model and one that was not, both doing CBT. I also have ethnic match and I have ethnic mismatch in the study. And so part of what I'm doing is looking to see how rapport develops and how much culture is impacting the counseling relationship throughout the 20 weeks that they receive services. And but I want to see that when there's an ethnic match and when there's not, because we have mixed literature that talks about the importance of ethnic match. I actually believe that you don't have to have ethnic match when you're doing clinical services with clients, but I do feel that the way to overcome the rapport problems that happen in the beginning are to do exactly what I'm saying, make culture on the table from day one. And so part of what these intentional multicultural interviews do is there are questions that are loaded with cultural foundation. And what you're doing, especially if you're working with kids, you are socializing them to recognize that you are a person that's open to talking about culture. Why would I say that? Because many kids of color are trained to not talk about culture if they're not talking to their family. So they don't bring it up unless somebody else brings it up. And you are providing the context and the space for that to happen. And so a couple questions there. How does race influence your peer relationship? That might not be the first question, but that is a question that's included in there. And I'll show you how many questions there are. Describe the communication style of your family. Remember I said that there were dynamics that you had to kind of think about when it comes to learning or building cultural literacy, and one of them is communication. Compare the relationships with adults at school to your elder family members, and I choose the word elder on purpose because that is showing the hierarchy, and in many groups of color it is a given hierarchy within the home, and by saying elder you're recognizing and acknowledging that hierarchy is there. I have a very strong belief that including the family is really important if you're working with kids. So in my practice, I do a part-time private practice, and this is my 10th year there now. And with the kids that I see, I don't see them in isolation. I feel like I can see them and I do individual work with them, but I also split the sessions with family because part of the job is for me to help shape the family, and so the family can be me. So they don't need to come to me forever. It's part of me training them to work together, and then they can move off on their own and they no longer have a need for me. So including the family from a cultural context, particularly if the family is from a collectivistic culture. Has anybody heard that term, collectivistic? So it's a we-ness, a sense of we-ness rather than I-ness. And so American culture is pretty much I, whereas collectivistic cultures are very much we, family-oriented, connections, building, relying on others, that kind of thing. So family inclusion you need. Also, a strength-based perspective. And this one I think is challenging in particular for us because being trained in a deficit model that people come when there's a problem, we come and we're having to look for a diagnosis to get the insurance company to pay for the services that we're providing. It's a deficit model. But if you start from the strengths, you can build on those strengths and remediate the weaknesses. And so always coming from what's working. So there are populations that are really hard to serve and you think, oh my gosh, there's nothing I can do. I'm just keeping them alive. I'm just maintaining them at this point. There's still something working. And so you have to dig to try and find out what that is. And typically it's going to be some kind of a cultural aspect of their coping. So just the intentional multicultural interviews, I don't expect you to write it down. I just wanted to show you that there are lots of questions that I have in there, but there are domains. So you see that first section, the biggest domain has to do with family. If you do interviews with people and you typically use like a semi-structured interview and it's like the SCICA or something where it's very pointed questions, or the Basque structured developmental history, they're demographic. And they don't really give you the qualitative piece that you need. And so these are things that when I'm meeting with a family, I'm asking these kinds of questions so that I can get that context. So I've got family, I have peers, I have race, I have ethnicity, and I have personal. So personal strengths and weaknesses. And these are just kind of springboards for other questions. So it's like these are the minimum that you would ask, and then you bounce off of those to ask follow-up questions to get better understanding. All right, so let me do, what I'm going to do is walk you through from the beginning to the end on how that integration might happen. So I've just described the person who's providing the services has to have self-awareness, you have to have understanding of the other culture, and you also have to do integration, individualized integration. So thinking about not only the group that you know about, but then what are the within group variations for that particular person. And so what I'm doing now is kind of talking through a culturally responsive model in the context of CBT, which I know some of you may or may not use cognitive behavior therapy, but I'm not going through cognitive behavior therapy now, but just knowing that that's an evidence-based practice that we have, but on top of that, we can really integrate culture within it. So rapport building. So that's the first thing. That's build that relationship, get to know the person, understand who they are. So how that happens, you can use your cultural literacy data to avoid those cultural mishaps or cultural blunders. So I can think of a mishap that I made when I was in training and I was meeting other interns. I was doing a master's degree in Los Angeles, and I was working at an agency that was a family therapy training institute. It was awesome. And so at this place, there were 7 interns, and so I was meeting the other interns, and I walked up to a man, to each person that was there, but the man was a Hasidic Jew. And I reached out my hand to shake his hand and say hello and introduce myself. And when I did that, he put his hands in his pockets and he so politely told me that he is not allowed to have physical contact with any person that's not his wife. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. Oh. But that was a huge mishap because I did not have that knowledge base. Now, if he was, let's say he was going to be the parent of a child that I'm working with, and I start our relationship out like that, what do you think he'd think about me? She can't work with my child. She doesn't know anything about who we are. That's what he thinks. So those kinds of things, like I've learned it, I won't make that mistake again, haven't then, since then. But the idea is to know that I needed to respect his culture. I was very American. Sticking my hand out like that. Now, if it was the other side of me, I'm one of those, I'm a big old hugger, and so I hug everybody that I'm close to, or people that I see, if I've seen you more than 2 times, you get a hug. So, and so what if I went for the hug? Oh gosh, that would have been a huge blunder. So you can avoid those just by using your cultural literacy data. Be aware of cultural norms to understand the meaning of eye contact and worldview and perceptions of the counseling relationship. And so eye contact, you've probably read in certain cultures that you look away when you're listening and you look more direct when you're talking, and that it may be the reverse for other cultures. And there are many, many times that I watch teachers interact with kids and will yell and say, look at me when I'm talking to you. And I'm like, oh, because most often the child's actually trying to be respectful, and they're demonstrating their shame for their behavior by not making the eye contact. They're not, doing the direct, I'm going to stare you down kind of thing. They're doing the opposite. And so to make that knowledge important for the teachers to know is really a good thing. And so if you're in a context where that could potentially occur, you just kind of pass on that knowledge and say, it could be. You don't have to say it's a fact, but you could say it could be that their intention was. And then all you're doing is giving data for that person to start to question or wonder and not make an interpretation based on how they were raised. Because, right, most people, if you were raised that way, you have that same expectation because that's respectful. But that may not match the culture of that child. So rapport building is part of that. Using attending skills. And attending skills is a counseling term, but that's the listening thing. So how you make eye contact, how close you are with the person that you're working with. See if that matches, because you want to actually mirror the person that you're working with so that you can build a rapport with them. If you don't mirror that, then you're going to have barriers, and it's harder to make the connection. And then explain what you do without jargon as much as you can. I'm one of the worst because when it comes to, if I'm talking about testing, I'm using acronyms and I forget. And so with parents, I have to say, okay, I have to say what it is because they don't do this. So whatever your role is, make sure that you slow it down a little bit. And I'm not going to say dumb it down because I don't think you're doing that. But slow it down and think about, okay, if I've never been in this situation before, how would I want to be treated? How would I want to be spoken to? Because a lot of times you have the power. They don't have the power. And so if you recognize that, it's like you want to reduce that power hierarchy as much as possible, and by removing jargon is one way to do that, because all it does is go whoop, and it takes it up like you have the knowledge that I don't have, so that means you have more power. So think about that when you're speaking. And then last, this is kind of an obvious one, but avoid making value judgments about the family or the culture. Okay, I am running short, so I'm just seeing it's 40 minutes, so let me I'll go through this one quickly. No stories, sorry. Okay, so history gathering and understanding the reason for referral. Ask questions about the culture, particularly about once you have cultural literacy, you want to individualize that. Establish rapport with the client and at least one other family member. Assess the reason for referral in the context of the client and family. and complete those intentional multicultural interviews, and complete a cultural genogram. That would be ways that you can interface all of that. Identifying strengths and difficulties. Generate a list of culturally related personal strengths, interpersonal cultural supports, and environmental cultural supports. And so these are things like, what do they rely on to cope? How have they solved problems before? These are personal, and then there are environmental ones, like there are things in their environment that may be working, there may be things that are not. But you want to know strengths, not just the barriers. Get details about the family context, including acculturation and ethnic identity development, as I said before. And then also think about the social support network and the home, school, and the community, because oftentimes you're going to find that the families that you're working with, they have people that support them that are part of their formal kinship network, which are blood relatives, and their informal kinship network, which are people that aren't blood relatives but act just like them. So they may call them aunt and uncle, but they're not really related. And so you'll hear kids say that, well, my auntie such and such, well, she's not really my aunt. Well, that's an important person. And so making sure that they're considered as part of the support network. Social involvement, meaning things that they're doing, activities like church or anything that makes the family feel connected to some other place. And religious and spiritual context, which is how religion or spirituality helps their coping in the home. And then the child responds to the authority in the family as it compares to authority figures in other settings. Typically, you might see different kinds of behaviors based on those two different contexts, and I ask pretty direct questions when it comes to the kids. I'll ask, so how are you different when you're at home versus school? And see what I get. Setting goals, you want to integrate the cultural values and beliefs into the goal setting process, which means you are not writing the goals for them, you're writing them together. It's a community process. You want to encourage a pattern of realistic thoughts and emotions, if you're using like a CBT model, that are in proportion to the events and cultural experience of the child. So that is, you're setting the goals, the treatment goals, based on what their expectations are, and then based on what you know that they need to do when it comes to changing their thoughts. Collaborative, as I mentioned, you want to have goals that integrate family expectations, and you want to consider acculturation. So remember, I started with how acculturation and building that literacy is important, and now we're seeing it's throughout the process, not just in the beginning. And then the goals, they have to be attainable. So you want to make it so that they can be successful. So I wouldn't start with some massive goal that would take 10 years to get to. Start with something small and then change it and revise it to meet their needs. Treatment implementation, I'm going to go quickly through this one. Make sure the steps, they're attainable steps, and they were set by you as well as the family. Include methods that are culturally driven and inclusive of the values and beliefs. The collectivistic worldview, as I mentioned, so use a systems-based approach to treatment. So having just individual therapy and that being your only approach may not be the right method. Have I said include the family? Just making sure. Include cultural norms there. I love this slide, and the reason why is because I've had so many kids over the years that have given me clues into how they experience culture, and so here's a couple of examples. So kiddo saying things like, the world's just not fair to people like me. There's meaning in people like me. And so you would want to explore racism and discrimination, isolation, those kinds of constructs there. My worlds collided today. I have this great story of a client that was living pretty bicultural, where she had a group of black friends, she had a group of white friends, and then she interacted with them differently, and everybody met up in the same place right at her locker one day. And she came in that day to see me, and she just fell in the chair and she said, my worlds collided today. I'm like, so what happened? And then she told the story, and I was like, well, who are you? Because I would see the difference when she's telling a story. I knew exactly who she was with, because her mannerisms and how demonstrative she was told me who she was hanging out with. And so then once I asked who she was, that shaped the rest of our work from that day forward, all the way through. Because she needed to recognize that she is all of those things. She's not one or the other. She's all of those things. I'm trying to find myself. Could be racial, ethnic, or sexual identity. No one seems to understand me. That's things like language differences, communication style, the mismatch that's there. I am the dark one in the family. So in multiple cultures, not just African American cultures, but in Latino cultures, same thing. When darker skin can have a negative connotation, and then children will experience the discomfort associated with that. So skin color and skin tone sometimes has meaning, including family hierarchy and status in the culture. Okay, analyze your goals. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, termination. Carefully planned and completed. So do it slow, take your time, inform the client when they've started the phase. Don't just spring it on them. Oh, next week's our last week. That doesn't work so well. Empower them to continue on their journey. Frame the client's success as their own success, not your success, whatever your role was in working with them. You do not want it to come across as, you came to me and we fixed it and yay, now you're fixed, because that's not what it's about. It's really their success because they've done all the work. They've seen you an hour a week or whatever, frequency that you have. So it's really helping them see that they've done it and they can continue on that path. And then include the family as supports to maintain the change. So like I said, you don't want to make it so that it's just individual work, because then you'll be needed forever. And so rather you have the family take it on. And I like this phrase, a clinician is the match that started the flame, but the family system is the oxygen that sustains it. And so sometimes I'll say that to families and they will kind of go, oh, I get that. All right, so the end. Thank you, and questions.